What's up, guys? I'm DK, and you're watching Pro Wrestling What If, the series where I look at the different what if scenarios as terms of the world that we call professional wrestling. Terry Allen, also known as Magnum T.A, a superstar who was on the rise to the top not only throughout NWA and Jim Crockett Promotions, but of all of professional wrestling. Magnum T.A would have two reigns with the NWA United States Championship, including one that he had won against Tully Blanchard in a famous I Quit match at Starrcade 1985. After having a best of 7 series feud with Nikita Koloff over the United States Championship, Magnum T.A was set aside on Ric Flair and the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. However, in October of 1986, Magnum T.A would be involved in a tragic car accident that would explode his C4 and C5 vertebrae, causing him to be paralyzed on the right side of his body and had ended his professional wrestling career. Now, I know a couple of you have requested this episode about Magnum T.A, which I thought it was a perfect time to do another non-WWE related what if, especially talking about those big what ifs of how a career could have turned out in the form of Magnum T.A. So of course, today's episode is going to be what if Magnum T.A didn't get into the car accident in 1986. This episode is going to be based off of the 5 big points, so let's kick off with number 1. So the first point of what if Magnum T.A didn't get into the accident is that he would have won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Of course, that's kind of a given since after the best of 7 series with Nikita Koloff, he was scheduled to be in a feud with the Nature Boy Ric Flair, seemingly going after the NWA World Heavyweight Championship scheduled for Starrcade 1986. And there was even talks of potentially Magnum T.A actually winning the championship that night. But with the car accident involving Magnum T.A, Magnum's spot was replaced by a newly turned babyface Nikita Koloff going after Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which would end in a disqualification. So just by the way that match finished involved with Nikita Koloff and Nature Boy Ric Flair, it makes me think, would that have been the exact same finish for the Magnum T.A Ric Flair match, especially because back in those days, they always had those quote-unquote dusty finishes to extend the feud. So it makes me believe that maybe 1986 wouldn't have been the year that Magnum T.A would have won the title, and that it would have created more of a chase for him to maybe even win the championship against Ric Flair at perhaps 1987 Starrcade event. But one thing that I do think is that this would have caused a new multi-year feud involving with Magnum T.A and Ric Flair. And seeing during the mid-80s of the feud between Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair and how long that would have lasted, because both Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes were really high on Magnum T.A being the next big babyface, that we probably would have seen basically the end of the 1980s be revolved around Magnum T.A and Nature Boy Ric Flair. Whether it's Magnum T.A chasing for the championship or it's flopping back and forth of either or holding the championship, this probably would have been the main focal point of Jim Crockett Promotions during the end of the 1980s. But it was definitely a given that at some point Magnum T.A would have won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship and probably would have had multiple reigns with it. The second point I wanted to bring up is the amount of superstar trajectories that could have happened had Magnum T.A not gotten in the accident. Nikita Koloff, of course, that was the feud that Magnum T.A was just finishing up as he was preparing for the feud with Ric Flair. And so in this case, if Magnum T.A is still wrestling, there is no way that Nikita Koloff would have that babyface turn. And not only that, he probably would have held the United States Heavyweight Championship for much longer, since I believe he did drop it to Lex Luger at some point in the summer. But if anything, he probably would have held that title until maybe even Starrcade 1987, where in the real timeline, Dusty Rhodes did win the championship. So Nikita Koloff probably would have a lengthy United States Championship reign had Magnum T.A still been wrestling at that point. Months after Magnum T.A.'s accident, Sting would end up being signed to Jim Crockett Promotions, and he would later on have a 45-minute match with Ric Flair at the Clash of Champions event that would end up in a time limit draw. So it makes me think that with Magnum T.A. still around, does Sting end up getting the push that he does, which I think Sting would have still had that huge push, but I think it would have been delayed because the late 80s would have been revolved around Magnum T.A. and Ric Flair. At around the time that Sting got signed, so did the total package Lex Luger, who would end up becoming a member of the Four Horsemen, later winning the United States Championship from Nikita Koloff, even being the one to drop it to Dusty Rhodes, and then later leaving the group to feud with Ric Flair. So it makes us wonder also, does Lex Luger not only get a world championship reign or a world championship feud, but does he even break off from the Four Horsemen at some point? And if he does it happen later on? Which I think he probably would stick with the Four Horsemen for much longer than he would have. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat would defect from WWE in 1988 and join Jim Crockett Promotions, which would lead to an epic series of matches with the Nature Boy Ric Flair. So with that in mind, does this mean that with a huge Magnum T.A. Ric Flair feud, that there's a chance that we never get Ric Flair versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat in some sort of feud? Which is something crazy to think about, considering that Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair have had such classic matches that some of them are even considered as the greatest of all time. And also with the American Dream Dusty Rhodes, what would happen to him? Maybe without the accident that none of the things that happened with Dusty Rhodes later on would happen, especially getting fired by Jim Crockett Promotions and effectively defecting to the WWE, where he would spot the polka dot attire. So maybe there's a chance that Dusty Rhodes may have never had an in-ring career in WWE had this incident not happened. I truly think that this car accident would have created a lot of superstar trajectories. Point number 3 that I wanted to bring up is that I think that Jim Crockett Promotions would have still been bought out. At this particular time in the 1980s, it was either going to be Vince McMahon with WWE, or of course, like we've seen in the real timeline, Ted Turner with the eventual WCW. That would have bought out Jim Crockett Promotions and basically ended the territories once and for all. If Ted Turner wasn't able to buy Jim Crockett Promotions at that point, I think he would have bought in some sort of other company, whether it's, let's say, an AWA or a world-class championship wrestling, and with the amount of money that Ted Turner has is definitely much more than Jim Crockett Promotions had had. So I think if anything, Jim Crockett Promotions probably would have lasted maybe to the end of the 1980s, but then when going into the 1990s, you know that probably there's going to be some sort of financial issues involving with Jim Crockett Promotions and would eventually have to be bought out. Point number 4 that I wanted to bring up is that I think at some point Magnum T.A. would head over to the WWE. Now, it's been discussed about that Magnum T.A. would have wanted to end his career basically at the age of 30. However, with the amount of money that of course Vince McMahon was pumping up at the time, especially with the rise of Hulkamania, that Vince McMahon probably would have threw some sort of money offer to Magnum T.A. that he just simply could not refuse. And especially right at the beginning of the 90s is when the rise of Sting would happen, and I feel like at some point Magnum T.A.'s spot at the top of the mountain would be taken over by a guy like Sting. But the question is, when would Magnum T.A. make the jump over from Jim Crockett Promotions, or at this point WCW, over to WWE? And I think it would be right near the end of the golden era, going into that new generation era. And I think that would have been the perfect time, since of course Hulk Hogan was already starting to go on his way out, especially with the steroid allegations beginning at this particular time, which would force Hulk Hogan to be off TV. But at the same time, would he be as big of a star in WWE as he would be in Jim Crockett Promotions? Because we know of Vince McMahon kind of changing the way that superstars either are named or looked. Just take Dusty Rhodes for an example, like I mentioned, where he came in wearing yellow polka dots on a black t-shirt. He definitely was not wearing that when working with Jim Crockett Promotions. So we probably wouldn't have gotten the same Magnum T.A. that we would have seen in the 80s. We probably would have seen some sort of weird, watered down version. And I think maybe at this point, WWE would experiment with the idea of a Magnum T.A. heel run, especially since, of course, in Jim Crockett Promotions, he was being built as the top babyface of the promotion, so there was no talks at any point of him turning heel. And as terms to different accomplishments when he's at WWE, I unfortunately don't think that he would probably ever win the WWE Championship, but at least I do think that at some point he would become the Intercontinental Champion, whether a babyface or a heel, and I actually could see a scenario where he would win King of the Ring, maybe even a better option for 1995's King of the Ring instead of having Mabel win it. And I could see a world where we could get a decent match out of Diesel and Magnum T.A. at the 1995 SummerSlam event that definitely would have turned out better than seeing Mabel versus Diesel in the real timeline. And then point number 5 I wanted to bring up is that he would officially retire from professional wrestling at some point in the 90s. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, Magnum T.A. had discussed about wanting to basically retire at the age of 30 because it is more of a young man's game for professional wrestling. And I think once Magnum T.A. would be done with that WWE run in the 1990s, he would retire at that point with a substantial amount of money, and I could see him going to WCW, but more in a producer kind of role, and would probably do that until WCW's closing in 2001. And at this point, because Magnum T.A. has carved out a pretty successful career for himself in professional wrestling, that there would be a likeliness of him actually being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Something that seems very unlikely since we never actually got to see what the career of Magnum T.A. would be like in order for him to be recognized as a Hall of Fame professional wrestler. Anyways, guys, that's gonna be the end of this edition of Pro Wrestling What If. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Press the notification bell to be notified of when future episodes release, and let me know what you think would have happened if Magnum T.A.'s career wasn't cut short in 1986. And I hope to see you guys next week on Pro Wrestling What If.